I kind of bring attention to that. So in this condition, I can use the or if the one item is true or not. This can go on as complex as you need it to.
Can you refer to a specific variable, like let's say they're in session to fill up a form, timeout. You give them so many seconds.
Yeah, what you would do is you would set a timer, and if last key press resets the timer.
Right.
And if they don't press the timer and the timer goes down, hey, are you still here? Right. So yeah, absolutely. What I mean by this can go on to infinitum is I can have multiple or statements and multiple and statements, right? So if your if statement is getting muddy, consider creating a function that returns a true or false and call that function something meaningful, right? Because what you do not want to do is get into a scenario where, what I'm currently in, I'm cleaning up a coworker's code where we're checking various specific scenarios, ands, and then we have parentheses, and inside there's ors, but there's one and I don't understand the business logic behind it, so I don't know what's going on. I'm afraid to touch anything. What would have been better to do is create a function saying, does this condition equal true, and have the 4 or 5 checks to return true or false, and then does this significant thing become true, and return true or false where necessary, and then have is scenario A and is scenario B. That is way easier than the mix of ands or soup that I'm dealing with at the moment. So if you kind of limit it to 2, but that's just a general rule of thumb. There have been times where I've done 3, but it was very clear that the 3 were there, and I had a very clear reason for it. That's the absolute limit in my opinion. If you need to do more, consider abstracting that out and putting that into a function and return true or false. All right, the DOM. The DOM stands for document. So I'm just going to blaze through these. Please do the exercises on your own time. If you have any questions, sign up for Slack. I'm on there. I'm Jumbo on the Slack channel. I may be not busy at work one day and can help you out. Submit a pull request if you see a bug on there. Reach out. The Slack channel, take a little quick side note. If you have a question about programming in general, I highly, highly, highly recommend you just posting the question in the Slack channel, because I guarantee you there's someone who knows the answer and is willing to help. That happens all the time. I post a question, I see someone post a question, I jump in and help when I can. It's a very active dev channel. So Palm Beach Tech Slack channel, right? It's specifically the developers channel, right? Because that's where Damien, Greg, and I live. So DOM, document object model. You can think of this as a representation of the DOM itself, the HTML itself. It's not, because it's a representation of it. It's JavaScript's API that allows you access to the HTML, right? There are 5 ways to select an element on the DOM. I point out the first 3 just because you might see it in the wild, but I hate those. I like the bottom 2 because CSS selectors. Does everyone know what a CSS selector is? Advanced CSS selectors, any valid CSS selector can be used in the bottom 2, right? So if you're in a situation where you can't add an ID to an element or give it a specific class, you can do the parent-child nesting of the CSS, where dot parent caret my child or something, right? You can get specific with it as you need, and the last 2 allow you to do that. jQuery, anybody familiar with jQuery? That, except with not the $, right? You pass in a valid CSS selector and you go.
Eventually, return to move a node list.
I'm working on it. I'm getting there.
Oh my.
I'm getting there. All right, so the first one, the query selector is a method that returns the first item it encounters in the DOM. If no matches are found, null is returned. As I said, the specified selector is any valid CSS selector. Here's some HTML. Nothing scary. We've all seen HTML like this before. It's super special. Document.query selector, info area. I'm looking for info area, so get me that #ID info area, right? Query selector, paragraph. This is going to return me the first paragraph it finds. If I have 100 paragraphs on there, it doesn't care. It's going to give me the first one. Query selector, that's a valid CSS selector of getting any element with type of text, right? But this query selector is, again, going to return me the first item. Same thing with button. It's a class, but it's going to find me the first item. Query selector all is the method you need to return all of the items that match your query selector on there. This will be a node list. We talked about it a little bit. So it's an iterator. It's a node list. It's an array-like because it doesn't have all of the methods on like the array does. The array has map, filter, reduce, etc. Node list has for each. That's it. So again, looking at this example, we have document.querySelector all. This is going to return me a node list of one item because I have info area on there. I point this out just to show you can, but general rule of thumb is IDs per page should be unique. It doesn't not work anymore like it used to, like i.e. 6-7 days. If I had 2 IDs on a page, it would hit the shank. Like it got weird quickly. That has since been a bug that they fixed in browsers, so you can technically do that, but don't ever, because it's confusing, right? Because it's like IDs are meant to be unique. If you have 2 on there, which one are you referring to? And how do you know that you're referring to the one you think you are?
We've been using them as unique for so long, we're used to it. But they fixed it because nobody does it.
No one cares. So query selector all, again, a node list of all the items, paragraphs, text, and buttons. Here's a concept that I see for junior developers. When I do code reviews, the most common thing I see is traversing the DOM, and they're not caching it. When I say caching the DOM, I'm simply talking about creating a variable, doing the DOM lookup, and storing it in there. Looking up in the DOM is an expensive task, meaning it takes a lot of resources and energy to do that. And especially if the DOM is changing, adding stuff, removing stuff, you know, if you're adding things, you have just more things to look through in that context. If you know this one thing's not going to change, cache it. What do I mean by that? Let's look at this example. So, posts. I got some information from a database. I'm going to loop through it, build my string, and put it on the HTML. Each time I'm looping through the post data, I'm looking at the document. The document is everything. Doing query selector, looking down the tree to see which one first finds that, which one first finds posts. Cool. Then I select the tenor HTML and I add some stuff to it. That's all I'm doing. And every time I loop through that, I've got to re-traverse the tree. Loop through it again, re-look through the tree. Do it again, re-look through the tree. It gets expensive over time, especially if I'm doing multiple lookups. I did a speed test. There's a website that I can set up a scenario like this. And with one selector, not that big of a deal. They're kind of similar. It's like the selecting versus caching is like maybe 1/10 of a second different or whatever on like 100,000 lookups. But 2, 28% difference, like right away. Like I can do 28% less calls in the same loop if I'm looking up the document versus caching. So the simple fix for that is creating a variable, doing the lookup once outside of the loop, and then referring to it in the loop itself. So post data.enter HTML. Now, why is this faster? We talked about what a variable is at the beginning. A variable is a named location in memory. It is much faster for you to look at the memory location than it is to look at the DOM. Am I there? Am I there? Am I there? So that's why it's significantly faster. On small websites, not that big of a deal, but the project we just launched at the company, I'm working on a large-scale enterprise application, and doing DOM lookups is quite expensive, especially with very dynamic data. There are some sections that I know don't change, but inside so the ones that are dynamic, I obviously can't cache them because they do, but I still have a lot on the page. And if I add stuff and I'm looking for the same thing that I know exists, but there's dynamic stuff going in there, I just now have more places to look to check, because the check is not very efficient. It's going node tree branch 1, that's not it. Node tree branch 2, that's not it. Node tree branch 3, that's not it. And then it does that until it finds what you have, or it loops through all of it if you're doing the query selector all. So if you have a ton of paragraphs, now you've just done that loop 100 times, and you've relooked at the DOM 100 times. So cache your DOM, cache it, right? Same thing for variables. It's easy. Properties on the DOM. There's properties on the DOM. Surprise, surprise. It's an object, right? Each property method can be accessed by simply invoking the property name, and most properties can be overwritten. So here's my example of HTML. Document.querySelector. I'm caching it because I don't want to look it up every single time I do something. Notice I'm just calling .enterHTML or .enterText. They're distinctly different. They do different things. I want the HTML that's inside this element, or I just want the text regardless of the markup, right? So there's needs for that. If I'm creating the markup and then I'm injecting it, if I did enterText, it's going to remove all that markup I just created, or it'll literally put caret h1 close caret, etc. Right? So there's ways I can use that. But if I wanted to assign something to enterText or enterHTML, I simply equal it to something new, whatever that new thing is. So without using the assignment operator, I'm reading it. If I equal it to something, I'm setting it. That's it. I highly recommend selecting something and looking at it in the console, because it's going to give you a list of items that are on this that you may or may not know about, and it's huge. I would say I use about 8% of all that's available, but it's cool to know all that other stuff is available because it's useful information for every scenario, just not the scenario I'm working on most of the time. One of the ones I use all the time is class lists. Does this have this class? Remember jQuery, where I can add or remove a class list? So $, my class name dot add class or dot remove class. Well, we have a class list object that has 4 properties on, or 4 methods on it. It has add, remove, toggle, and contains. What do you think those do? They add, remove, toggle, or see if it contains it. jQuery is one of those prolific frameworks, libraries that have been around for so long that the language itself is starting to adopt some of its best practices, right? jQuery was born out of an era where Internet Explorer 6 was different than 7, which was different than 8, which was different than Chrome and Safari and Firefox. So selecting an element, adding event listeners, and doing simple traversal of DOM and whatnot was radically different. And you had to do all of the checking to see which browser you're in to do the right thing. Oh, that was a mouthful to say. I'm exhausted thinking about it. jQuery came into play and it did all that stuff under the hood for you, right? So you had a unified API that handled that. And if people mention is jQuery dead, the answer is no, not by a long shot. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. But I will say it has been about 4 years since I've picked jQuery up and used it in a greenfield project, right? Because most of the stuff that I care about in jQuery, the browser compatibility stuff too, is gone, and most of the stuff I care about is in the language itself. Yeah. Classlist.add, classlist.toggle. I used to use jQuery for that all the time. You know, and yes, it's a lot shorter to do .on or .off. But is it really that bad? Add event listener, remove event listener? I mean,
and really, more so, as far as being able to use JavaScript in general, like, I know a lot of people rely upon jQuery, whether they're using like WordPress or whatever, but if you were, you started 5 or 6 years ago, that made a lot of sense using jQuery, but now it's more like, one of the advantages you get into looking at this, you can actually debug a lot more code once you get more knowledge about JavaScript, rather than just relying solely upon jQuery. So there's an extra advantage to it, because I found that out after I was just jQuery world, and then all of a sudden we did this class like years ago, and then I realized like, oh, now I understand what all these things. Then when the vanilla JavaScript bugs would come up, I wouldn't be like, I'm not familiar with any of this stuff. I would know right away, like, okay, this makes total sense. So.
Absolutely. So debugging becomes a lot easier too, because now you have one less dependency. Is this a jQuery bug, or is this something that I actually caused, right? So by removing that, now I don't have to go into a function and it's like, oh, here's line 1, character 4,332. It's like the error here. Like, how does this happen? By removing jQuery, I'm just straight into vanilla JavaScript. if you don't want to look at the object, I highly recommend exploring the console that I showed off in the beginning, selecting something, kind of seeing what information you get out of that. You'll be surprised at what information, and be like, that's where it is. Why do we do that?
In Visual Studio, I've heard of a plugin called Lint.
Mhm.
Use that or something similar for debugging.
So ESLint is a little less about debugging and more about saving you from yourself, right? So there are rules that you can put in place that at author time, it'll warn you is incorrect, right? So if you declare a variable but you never use it, lint will tell you, hey, you've never used this, do you need it, right? Or if you declare two constants, let will tell you at author time that that's happening versus waiting for it to see it in the browser and fail, right?
These things
So
are standards that it puts right.
Yeah.
Beforehand.
So linting is more author time hinting and helping. Again, MDN, Mozilla Developer Network, is a great resource for all the documentation you're ever going to need. Most of the time, if I Google something CSS or JavaScript related, the first 3 links are going to be CSS Tricks, MDN, or W3 Schools have gotten their shit together. They're pretty good. A couple of years ago, I would have been like,
They used to hate on things.
like, because I've been a hiring manager, and about 7 years ago, I'd be like, how do you keep up with the industry being that it's moving so fast? If you tell me W3 Schools, I was like, you don't keep up, that is out of date. But now they've gotten their stuff together. There are some information that's still out of date, but they've done a massive rehaul, and they've been doing a lot better. So W3 Schools, their examples are really good as well. They've gotten a lot better. MDM is the bee's knees, and CSS Tricks. Who's here not heard of CSS Tricks? Okay, good. Everybody's heard of it? Nice.
Sweet.
Last thing I can talk about, last thing I can talk about is events. So the 3 things that, 4 things I mentioned were objects, arrays, loops, and coercion. Oh no, the DOM and coercion. Events, I'm going to add that to the 5th one. Events are important. JavaScript is a language that nothing happens until an event is triggered, right? When you go to a web page, the browser is registering all of these events, event A, event B, event C, whatever. This is the way of your browser saying, hey, this thing just happened. Hey, that thing just happened. Hey, I'm done doing this. Hey, I started that. If you want to do something with it, you can. And you do that by listening to an event. See, W3 Schools, it's there. There are a handful of events you can listen for. Wait, did I miss a point? So a mouse event is an interface that represents events that occur due to an interaction with a pointer. Right, so my mouse. Events I use often, mouse down, mouse up, right? Click. There's a difference between down and up and click, right? They distinctly make those distinctions. Double click, when I move my mouse over and when I move it out, right? Those are different events. And the mouse wheel, that's another one I use a lot. Touch events. Touch events are an interface that represents an event sent from when the state connects with touch-sensitive surfaces. Touchscreens or trackpads are the most common used. Touch start, end, move, and cancel. Again, there's a few more out there, but these are the ones that I most frequently interact with. Keyboard events. The typer thing that I was showing you guys, I've hooked into the typer events. Every time the user presses a key, I'm checking to see what key it is. Does it match the item that's in there? If it is, highlight green. If it's not, I highlight red. And I'm using the key down or key press, event to accomplish that. So use those very often. Form event. This one's fun. Used for a lot of form validation too, in the sense of when I hover over something, when I put the cursor inside there, I click inside. That's the focus event. When that cursor goes out of that, it's the blur event, and I can do things with them as far as validating on blur, making sure it's the right thing. We also have the change. So every time the user enters a key, that's a change to the input field. when the user selects a different radio button, that's a change to the radio button, selects a drop down, etc. And submit is obviously when the form submits, right? Use these all the time. Window event. Scroll, resize, has changed, load, unload. There's a couple of new ones that are coming out that I'm super excited about, but the browser support isn't out there. But Object Observer is pretty cool. I've run into this scenario constantly where videos will start playing on page load, but it's not on screen. It's been tricky to do that up until recently because of the Object Observer. Like, I had to do this weird math of figuring out where it is on the page, looking at the DOM height and seeing if the X is lower than the DOM height and all that good stuff. So it's Object Observer kind of will tell you if it's in the window or not, and that'll be cool because you can tell it like when it's getting close. You can tell when it's half on screen. You can tell when it's fully on screen. All sorts of good stuff. But browser support is coming. So how do we add all this stuff, right? So we have two methods at our disposal. We have add event listener. We need to attach it to something. That's the biggest thing I want to get across. Is you can't attach something to nothing, right? So this could be a DOM element, an individual paragraph, a button, a span tag if you wanted to. Anything on the DOM you can attach an event listener to. It could be the document or the whole window itself, right? So the window is where the Object Observer kind of lives, and the resizer, so I can attach an event listener to that. This accepts minimum 2 arguments. The first argument is what are you listening for? Click, double click, mouse enter, mouse leave, what it needs to be listened for. And the second is the callback. What do you want to happen when this is triggered? When double click happens, what do you want to do? So I'm selecting an element, adding event listener, passing in the event I want to listen for and the function that I want to execute when that is triggered. Boom. The function that's being called, the callback, the anonymous function that we're passing, will always be returned the event object. I recommend playing around with that. Console log E and see what you get. Because there's a bunch of information on there that you can use to manipulate the interaction with your user. One of the best examples I have in the exercises is I want to know the exact X and Y location that the user's mouse entered and when it leaves. So on the screen, in the middle of the box, I say mouse entered at X and Y, blah, blah, and it left at blah, blah. It's a thing I could do, right? I need to know that information for reasons of making games, or if I scroll all the way to the bottom, making sure you've read the terms and conditions, right? Those are things I would look for, seeing what the scroll position is. Again, we can do document.querySelector, header, add event listener. That's fine, but I still recommend caching the DOM. Just get into the habit of creating a variable, selecting the DOM, and storing it in there. It doesn't hurt it to do this way, just it's a good practice of mine. Here's an example of query selectoring all. It's an array-like item. The only method on there is for each. So I can loop through each item that I get back from the document. That's super useful. And then what I'm doing in there is every item in there, I'm adding a click listener. And then what am I doing? I'm passing it in that function. So if I click on item 3, e.target will be item 3 because that's what I clicked on. E is the object that's being passed in there. One of the keys on there is target, which gives me all the information about that particular item. So parent is the e.target, so I have class list. If I want to add or remove something, if I click on something and I want to toggle a border or a class on there, I can do that with that information. Now, one thing I want to point out that I find super useful too is I don't need to go from the document every single time to look for an element. Right? If I've selected an element, there's a method on there called querySelector or querySelectorAll. So if I want to start from the thing that I've already selected and look inside there, I can do that with this. So all of my items have an H1, but I want to find the H1 that I clicked on. So parent.querySelector, find me the first H1 starting from this node. This can also be a performance boost because you're looking at a specific spot in the DOM. You already know where it's at. You don't have to go to the top and go all the way down, right? So not only is it a variable that you've cached, but it's also a very specific subset of the HTML tree that you're looking at. So I use that all the time. I'll cache the parent and then use the parent to find all of its children, because if there's a class name that lives somewhere else, I can guarantee that I'm never going to select it because I'm starting from the parent, and it's not if those two class names are in separate parents, we're good to go. All right, last thing is remove event listener. This simply removes an event handler that has been registered with the add event method. The catch to that is I cannot remove an event that is an anonymous function. It has to be an external declared function in order for me to remove it. So, 2 examples. All I'm doing is clicking on 2 elements. Element 1, that click. All right, I'm anonymous. This will come out in the console. Click 2, external function. It's an external function because it's outside of the callback, and I'm passing it as an argument. If I remove event listener on the first item, it's still there. I'll still click on it. If I remove event listener on item 2, it's gone. I can't click on the item anymore. The reason this happens is because there's nothing to remove in an anonymous function. If you have no reference to the thing, to the function, what are you removing? So if it's an anonymous function, it doesn't have a name, and if you have to refer to a name to remove it, what name do you refer to? Yeah, I said that.
Bang. So, a boom.
All right, I think that's all the time we have, but JSON, that's a good one to look at. There's 3 extra sections in the Markdown file: JSON, promises, and fetch API. I don't know what time to go. We gotta get out of here. Does anybody have any questions? We do have a few minutes for questions.
Did you go over what reduce does? And it's in use.
I did not, but I use it in one of the examples.
In general?
I use it all the time.
I mean, I have no idea what it does.
So, okay,
I heard it in
reduce.
combination with map reduce.
Yeah. So reduce returns a single output based on the information in there. It accepts 2 arguments. It accepts the accumulator, a starting point, and then the individual item. And it'll also give you the index and the overall array. Here's a couple of places you guys can go to. Check this out. Shameless plug. A tool I made for students like you. It'll take a second to load. Sample APIs. Does anybody know what a RESTful endpoint is? A RESTful API is? Does anybody hate messing with RESTful endpoints and authentication and trying to get authenticated just to do something simple? Okay. Well, this is a RESTful endpoint that's got a whole bunch of information about nothing important. Right? It's got Futurama references. It's got football references. Someone contributed like presidents. So it's a RESTful endpoint for you to get information, consume it, and do something with it. Right? So avatar, Futurama, info, characters, cast, episodes, questions. And when I taught at Palm Beach Code School, one of our end projects in JavaScript was a Futurama quiz. So display the questions, possible answers, check it against the correct answer, and if they get it right, say huzzah. If they get it wrong, shame them, right? That's where questions come from. What I like to use and what I like to do, and this is for you back there. You and I were talking about this earlier.
Yeah.
Futurama. So I'm at sampleapis.com/Futurama, and I go into inventory. So if I want to use this, I'm going to open up CodePen. Has anyone not used CodePen before? I want to do a little bit of live code and see how well I did.
Ooh.
All right, so CodePen is an online playground that allows you to play with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you're looking to mess with a preprocessor or compiler that you don't have a local environment set up on, this is a good place to go to. So it's like anybody not using Sass but want to learn about it, go here. Anybody using Babel but not really understand what's happening, go here, right? Because we can set these presets here to be different types of preprocessors. So I can have none, or I can use any of the ones that are on here. I personally cannot write normal CSS anymore. I have to use the SCSS version. So at a high level, I'm going to quickly talk about a couple of concepts that were coming up in there. So we're going to talk about fetch. Stop it. And then I need this URL. And this is a long-winded way to get to your reduce question as well. Yeah, but this is baked in. I don't have to pull in the library. So fetch is a new API to do asynchronous calls, AJAX calls, right? Console.clear. This returns a promise. A promise is an IOU. It's a way for you to say, go give me some information, and then tell me when you're done with it, and then I'll go do something. How do I accept that promise? I do it .then. It passes me a response object, which has methods on it, one of them being response.json. That is a promise in and of itself. So the data that comes back isn't JSON to start with, it's a response header. Because it could be HTML, it could be whatever. Fetch doesn't assume anything. So I know it's going to be JSON, so I'm going to say response.json. Promise me you're going to give me back JSON, right? So how do we get that? We get then data. I'm going to open up the console. Boom. This is the API, right? So to answer your question, I want to know how many items I have in my store, right? So if I look at this, I have a data, 0, stock. That's the key I'm looking for. So this is the one concept that I've been talking about that really helped me understand the data I'm manipulating, is look at each individual thing at the beginning. I know that this is an array. I need to go to an index to get an item. The item that is at a particular index in this context is an object. What do I do with an object? I look at the keys to figure out the information I need. I know I need stock. I want to add up all the stuff I have in my store. That's the point of doing the reduce, right? So if I do const data total equals data reduce accumulator, right? This is what's going to be added to item. Arrow function, and then my starting point, right? So I'm going to start at a number. So let's do console log real quick. What is item? So this is the context that I was talking about, where it's like I just explore the console a little bit to see what each item is. So each item that comes back is the individual thing. So now I know I can do item dot stock. Let me console log that. Okay, this is all the item stock values that come back. So how do I add them to each other, right? So I can do simply return ACC plus item dot stock. So if I do this in console log total, boom, that's how many things I have in my store right now.
There's a lot.
Yeah, there's arachno sports, which are 1 billion. So
that's mostly.
It's inflating it for sure, right? So this
But
is
you
what
could do
reduces.
something where you say eliminate the records.
I absolutely could.
So you don't have to do it now.
So reduce is a way of taking a set of data and reducing it to a smaller, singular subset of information. There are multiple use cases for it. This is the simplest way to explain what a reducer is, but I've used it in the past. Let me show you this example. Public, this.
Robot.
Don't be too far back. I do a lot of things. I swear. So there's a scenario where I want to. Oh, do I have it in the showcase? Please be there. Yeah. All right. So this uses reducer to look at the name fields of each individual item. Based on the name field, create an object, and then assign that object's key to that value. So if I display data, the data I'm looking at is this fake data. Let's take a look at the HTML real quick to prove a point. My name is name.first. This is going to translate to name.first, right? So I'm using reducer in both ways to expand this object or look at the DOM and create the object where necessary. So if I display data, boom. So this is a way for me to use my name attribute in the HTML as some sort of schema that I can create an object that I then am going to save to a database, right? So reduce has multiple methods or use cases for it. It's not strictly numbers. That's the point of showing that. Any other questions? We have 3 minutes.
Why can we ask questions in the future?
I'll show them the demo for the event.
Oh. All right, so the event listeners that we're doing, we're listening for multiple events. We're listening for form change events, we're listening for toggle events, and we're listening for mouse events. So when I type in this input field, I want welcome whatever my username is. This is the change event that's happening. If I click this button, I want this image to hide and show. Boop. And you have to make the sound effects. If you don't, that's weird. And then notice as I move in at the spot, I move in and out.
And that's what we were saying before the or the event properties.
So if we look at the events for it,